I'll get back to your calls in a few moments, but something I wanted to speak about with you this week. Israel's parliament has passed a law, yesterday it passed it actually, imposing the death penalty on Palestinians convicted of fatal terror attacks. It's a measure that's being criticised very sharply as discriminatory in nature by European countries and by civil rights groups as well. It makes the death penalty the default punishment for Palestinians in the Israeli-occupied West Bank for terror attacks. For those found guilty of intentionally carrying out deadly attacks deemed acts of terrorism by a military court, not a civil court. Let's dig down into some of the detail of this with Terry Newman, Israeli entrepreneur, member of the World Jewish Congress's Jewish Diplomatic Corps and chairman of the public board of Bina, the home of Israeli Judaism, based in Tel Aviv. Good afternoon to you, Terry. Thank you for joining me.
Good afternoon. Nice to be with you.
Is this law, which as I understand it can still be overturned by the Supreme Court in Israel, but is it strictly limited to Palestinian people only?
No. So first of all, Israel has had capital punishment since the founding of the state. Capital punishment has been used once. It was in the case of Eichmann, a Nazi war criminal who was hunted down in Argentina and then brought to justice and was hung. What's happened over the last 48 hours is political gaming and nonsense. The law will never actually come into effect in Israel. This was, said as much by Yair Lapid, the leader of the opposition, as well. The Prime Minister Netanyahu knows this as well.
Why will it not? Why will it not?
Because it will be struck down by the court system. In Israel, similar to the UK, there's a separation between the executive, the legislative, and the judiciary. And this is certain parts of the law don't work in terms of Israel's existing arrangements with other laws which are currently in Israel. Now, to put this in broader perspective, though, the woman who passed it, her husband was brutally murdered by a Palestinian terrorist and then wasn't brought to justice because of complications of, without going and boring all of your listeners. And so this was a political stunt. There's huge pressure was being put on because a budget needed to be passed. If you think of Boris Johnson in periods around Brexit, periods around COVID, doing funny things, trying to close down Parliament, knowing it would be blocked.
Yeah.
It's that kind it's that kind of issue. It's not actually going to come into law.
Well, I'm reassured to hear you say that. However, Boris Johnson did many things, but he didn't establish a law based on one group's ethnicity, did he? And the fact that some, and I stress some, in the Israeli Parliament were cheering and clapping for that is a sign of the times, isn't it?
Yeah, listen, there's no doubt about it that within the Israeli parliament, there are also, some members from the extreme right. We're a democracy. And, in democracies, you have people who agree with you and people who don't agree with you. But, I can tell you as well, from both the right wing, the centre and the left wing, there is a huge opposition to this law for actually many reasons. The first is the biggest terror attack in Israel's history was done by Hamas and the Nukba terrorists. This law doesn't cover them, because it's only going forward and it's not retroactive. Now, I'm somebody who believes that in very specific circumstances, capital punishment is something which has a place in society. It has to be used very carefully. It has to have judicial, oversight, etc. But as I say, this law is so out there, it will obviously be struck down, and it's not dealing with what actually needs to be dealt with.
But are you worried that it had the kind of vocal and audible support when it went through that it did have in Parliament?
Well, I can tell you that one of the main reasons why people also found it disgusting, the champagne and etc., was because in that same day, 5 Israeli soldiers were murdered by Hezbollah terrorists up north. So the concept of opening up champagne on a day like that just shows how, these people who are past this specific law, they're from a party called the Otzma Yehudit Party, which are a far right-wing party, which, we are very much against. But again, put it in the bigger perspective, this is not part of mainstream Israel. Whereas actually, if you look at the broader Middle East, there are countries where you do actually have, people being murdered on the streets for their ethnicity. We've also seen people being murdered on the streets for their sexual orientation. We've obviously seen this in Iran. People, you're obviously aware of what's happened there over the last 47 years.
Completely, but you wouldn't want them to be your yard. You wouldn't want them to be your yardstick, would you?
No, I absolutely don't. But what I will say is that societies similar to osmosis are, when they get affected by each other. And Israel at the moment is living in a cauldron where it is being surrounded by, Hezbollah terrorists in the north, Hamas terrorists in the south, Hamas and Iranian sympathizers in Judea and Samaria in the West Bank, Iran itself firing missiles non-stop. So it is understandable, even if I don't hold their views, why a small segment of Israeli society starts taking on those views. Now, but the rest of Israeli society will stand up against it. The Israeli democratic establishment will stop it. But yes, it is,
Well, part of the democratic establishment is, of course, Benjamin Netanyahu at the moment and his leadership, which has tolerated, more than that, invited into government the kinds of people who in Parliament the other day were drinking champagne, were wearing noose pins on their lapels, were celebrating a law that is, if not absolutely exclusively for Palestinians, largely wielded against Palestinians. I know you're saying it won't come to pass, but that doesn't mean it hasn't been passed momentarily in the Israeli parliament. And, people who are on the fringes of politics have a horrible habit of coming closer to the centre, don't they, if not stopped. A word that's thrown at Israel a lot is apartheid. I don't happen to believe it is an apartheid society, but laws like this look like an apartheid law, don't they?
No, absolutely not. So again, the woman who passed it, her husband had been brutally murdered by a Palestinian terrorist who was then not brought to justice. There are Arab members of the Supreme Court. There are Arab members of the Parliament. Right?
Yeah, I'm not saying...
but I understand where you're coming from, and this is why I want to go back
But it weakens the argument that it's not an apartheid society. I don't believe that it is, but it puts a dent in that, doesn't it, when you've got the kind of scenes we saw in Parliament yesterday, and that law being passed, even though you're assuring us it won't come to fruition. Because you are in an environment where you have had peace since the Second World War, it's very difficult to explain what it's like living in an environment where there are people who are not just saying they want to come and kill you, they are actually coming and murdering you on a daily basis. We've had 3-4 times already today ballistic missiles fired at us. Right, and these are ballistic missiles where now they're not just being fired with a missile itself, but as they get closer, they then open up and they spread about 50 different bits of shrapnel, the size of 50p coins, which are killing people. Yes.
Right. This is your reality. So the fact that a small group, and in Israeli coalition politics, you have small parties and in order to pass a budget where you need 61, and in the end it passed with 62, I think it was.
You needed to accommodate this law.
Exactly. There's
risky strategy.
This is listen. Democracy, as Winston Churchill once said, is the worst system of government other than all of the others. And one of the challenges, which I hope this doesn't come to the UK, but Europe has lived in a fairly peaceful environment since the end of the Second World War. I think that might be starting to change, because a lot of the systems that were put in place were to stop war inside of Europe. Right, and now most of the challenges are coming from China, from Russia, and obviously America's rising. There will be lots of questions asked, and in the same way that after 7/7, there were major questions that were being asked. If you had 7/7 happening on a weekly, on a daily basis, there would be elements.
I understand that, and I do.
Society that would be doing the same, and so I wouldn't call all of UK society, a fascist society. Because there would be 10% of it doing it, and it is the same point here.
Okay, and I'm not doing that. But what I'm saying is, if you want the true democracy that Israel and Benjamin Netanyahu, yourself, others, constantly tell us that Israel is. Those more fringe people, even if it is a grieving woman, she managed to get 62 to 47 in favour of this law. And the situation would be that Palestinians were seen in a different court than an Israeli citizen would be. That's not healthy, is it?
So you're referring to something else. The situation,
military courts and civil courts.
Yes, correct. So Israel has on multiple occasions tried to separate itself from the Palestinian communities in Judea and Samaria to an extent where there would be a Palestinian state. This was done, as you probably know, in 1948. This was done in the Oslo process. This was done later with Barak. This was done by Olmert. And this has also been, confirmed by third parties. This isn't just me saying it, right? And because every single time that was rejected by the Palestinian side, Israel has not been able to leave that area. At the same time, it has not annexed that area. So therefore, under the Geneva Convention, Israel hasn't annexed it. So it is still ruled under the military. That's why this is the case. It's a historical anomaly, which hopefully will be solved when there is a Palestinian leadership who can talk peace and deliver on peace, rather than delivering us Hamas and the 7th of October and thousands of Israelis being murdered. But is this a law I'm in favour of? No, but in the bigger picture, I'll say, and I pray this doesn't happen to the UK, but if in the UK you found yourself being attacked daily from where, of, English people were being attacked by Welsh people and Scottish people, as used to happen a few hundred years ago, right? There was obviously, sentiment that people went about these things. What happened during the Second World War when Britain was at war at Germany, right? There were certain elements of society, and that is the way that society works. That's
Can I
the
ask
way
you
that democracy
a
works.
final question before you go? You began and have repeated it a couple of times that the Supreme Court, that this will not come to fruition, that this will not be brought into the judiciary. It won't happen. Hasn't Donald Trump, hasn't Benjamin Netanyahu, I've been talking about Donald Trump a lot this hour, hasn't Benjamin Netanyahu been trying his damnedest to reduce the effectiveness and power of the Supreme Court over the last few years, predating October the 7th, for different reasons, but he has been pushing at it. Is it weakened? Can you say confidently that it will throw out this law?
So Prime Minister Netanyahu is currently in the middle of his own legal proceedings, and therefore, yes, he does have incentives to try and weaken the court inside of Israel. As Yair Lapid, the leader of the opposition, said very clearly, and as also members of the current coalition have made clear, this is something where it will just not come into force because Israel's commitments to various different international platforms will not allow it to happen. Therefore, there will be changes in the law, and there is already an actual serious law that's going through, which will deal with real terrorism, which is also, by the way, the majority of terrorists at the moment attacking Israel are Palestinian terrorists, but there have also been cases of Jewish terrorists, and Jewish terrorists have also been tried in the Israeli courts. And Israel, that is a country that is ruled by the force of law, will uphold that.
Terry Newman, thank you for joining me today. Israeli entrepreneur, member of the World Jewish Congress's Jewish Diplomatic Corps. 2:48.